Welcome back to Hold On, Survival Stories, where we explore the most extraordinary tales of human endurance, willpower, and the unbreakable determination to survive against impossible odds. I'm your host, and today's story will challenge everything you believe about the limits of human survival. Imagine this: you're alone on a life raft in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. No land is visible in any direction, just endless water stretching to the horizon. Your boat has sunk, taking all your supplies, your radio, and your hope of quick rescue with it. You have no food, no fresh water, and no idea if anyone even knows you're missing. How long could you survive? How long before hunger drives you to madness? How long before thirst becomes unbearable? How long before the vastness of the ocean breaks your spirit and convinces you to give up? This is the true story of Captain Roberto Silva, a 34-year-old commercial fisherman from Ecuador, who on March 15, 2019, set out for what should have been a routine 3-day fishing trip. Instead, he found himself fighting for survival on the open ocean for 86 days, nearly 3 months alone on a life raft, with nothing but his will to live, and an unshakable belief that somehow, someday, someone would find him. Roberto's story isn't just about surviving at sea. It's about the psychological journey from hope to despair to acceptance and back to hope again. It's about the moment when your mind starts playing tricks on you, when hallucinations become your only companions, and when the line between sanity and madness becomes as thin as the horizon between sea and sky. But most importantly, it's about what happens when giving up becomes the logical choice, the easy choice, the sensible choice, and you choose to hold on anyway. Roberto Silva had been fishing these waters for 15 years. He knew the Pacific off the coast of Ecuador, like most people know their neighborhood streets. He understood the weather patterns, the fish migration, and the seasonal changes that governed life on the ocean. He was an expert seaman who had survived storms, equipment failures, and countless challenges that the sea had thrown at him. But the ocean doesn't care about your experience. The ocean follows its own rules, and sometimes those rules are written in disaster. March 15, 2019, started as a perfect day for fishing. Calm seas, clear skies, and weather forecasts that predicted stable conditions for the next 72 hours. Roberto's boat, the Santa Maria, was a 32-foot fishing vessel that he had owned for 8 years. It was well maintained, properly equipped, and had never given him serious problems. Roberto was planning a solo fishing trip to a productive area about 60 miles offshore, where he had consistently found good catches of tuna and mahi-mahi. It was a routine trip that he had made dozens of times before, and he expected to return to port in 3 days with a full hold of fish. What Roberto couldn't have predicted was that a mechanical failure in his engine would leave him stranded far from shore. What he couldn't have foreseen was that his radio would fail just when he needed it most. And what he couldn't have imagined was that a sudden storm would sink his boat, leaving him alone on a tiny life raft in one of the most remote areas of the Pacific Ocean. But that's exactly what happened. And when Roberto Silva found himself floating on 6 feet of rubber and fiberglass, surrounded by thousands of miles of empty ocean, he had to make a choice that would determine whether he lived or died. He could accept that his situation was hopeless, that no one would find him in the vastness of the Pacific, that death at sea was inevitable. Or he could hold on to hope when hope seemed irrational, hold on to life when life seemed unsustainable, hold on to the belief that somehow, against all odds, he would see his family again. Roberto Silva chose to hold on, and what happened next would test every limit of human endurance, push him beyond the boundaries of sanity, and ultimately prove that the human spirit is capable of surviving things that should be impossible. This is the story of 86 days alone at sea. This is the story of a man who refused to die, even when death would have been easier. This is the story of holding on, when letting go would have been the simplest thing in the world. This is Roberto's story. The morning of March 15th dawned with the kind of crystalline beauty that makes commercial fishermen remember why they chose a life on the ocean. Roberto Silva stood on the deck of the Santa Maria, breathing in the salt air and watching the sun paint the Pacific in shades of gold and turquoise that no artist could capture. Beautiful day, old girl, Roberto said to his boat, a habit he had developed over 8 years of working alone on the water. Let's go catch some fish. The Santa Maria was Roberto's pride and livelihood. At 32 feet long, with a deep V hull designed for ocean fishing, she was perfectly suited for the offshore waters, where Roberto made his living. The boat was equipped with GPS navigation, VHF radio, fish finder, and all the safety equipment required by maritime regulations. Roberto had spent the previous evening preparing for his trip with the methodical care of someone who understood that the ocean forgives no shortcuts. He had checked the engine, tested the electronics, stocked provisions for 4 days, 1 extra day as a safety margin, and reviewed weather forecasts that predicted calm seas and light winds for the next 72 hours. Seas 2-3 feet, winds 5-10 knots from the southeast. No significant weather systems in the area. Roberto read from the marine forecast. Perfect conditions. The fishing grounds Roberto was targeting lay approximately 60 miles offshore, in deep water where the continental shelf dropped away into the Pacific's profound depths. It was an area he knew well, where upwelling currents brought nutrient-rich water to the surface and attracted large schools of tuna, mahi-mahi, and other valuable commercial fish. By 6:30 a.m., Roberto was underway, the Santa Maria's diesel engine running smoothly as he headed toward open water. The port of Salinas gradually disappeared behind him, and soon there was nothing visible except the endless expanse of the Pacific Ocean. Roberto loved this part of his work, the solitude, the connection with the ocean environment, the satisfaction of using his skills and knowledge to make a living from the sea. After 15 years of commercial fishing, he had never lost his appreciation for the ocean's beauty and power. Radio check. Radio check. Roberto called on his VHF radio as he reached the 20-mile mark. Fishing vessel, Santa Maria calling any station. Radio check. The response came back immediately from the coastal radio station. Santa Maria, this is Salinas radio. Reading you loud and clear. Have a safe trip, Roberto. It was a routine communication that Roberto made on every trip, establishing that his radio was working and that shore-based stations knew his location and plans. It was also the last normal radio communication Roberto would have for the next 86 days. At the 40-mile mark, Roberto noticed something that concerned him, a slight irregularity in his engine sound. It was subtle, just a minor change in the rhythm of the diesel that most people wouldn't have noticed. But Roberto had been listening to this engine for 8 years, and he knew its every sound and vibration. Easy, girl, Roberto said, checking his engine gauges. What's bothering you? The engine temperature was normal, oil pressure was good, and all other indicators were in the green. But the irregular sound persisted, and Roberto's experience told him that small problems could become big problems very quickly when you're 50 miles from shore. Roberto made the decision to continue to his fishing grounds, but to monitor the engine carefully. If the problem worsened, he would head back to port immediately, even if it meant losing a day's fishing income. By 10:30 a.m., Roberto had reached his target fishing area. The GPS showed his position as 60 miles west-southwest of Salina, in water over 3,000 feet deep. The sea conditions were exactly as forecast, calm and blue, with gentle swells that made for comfortable fishing. This is why we do this, Roberto said to himself, setting up his fishing lines. Days like this make all the rough weather worth it. The fishing was excellent from the start. Within an hour, Roberto had caught 3 yellowfin tuna, each weighing over 30 pounds. The fish finder showed large schools moving through the area, and Roberto began to think this might be one of his best trips of the season. But at 1:15 p.m., the engine irregularity that had been bothering Roberto all morning suddenly became a major problem. The diesel began running roughly, then started missing, then died completely. Roberto immediately went to the engine compartment to diagnose the problem. What he found made his stomach drop. The fuel injection pump had failed catastrophically, with metal shavings visible in the fuel system. It was not a problem that could be repaired at sea with the tools and parts Roberto carried. Okay, not a problem, Roberto told himself, though his voice carried a note of concern. Call for a tow, get back to port, fix the engine. Just another day at the office. Roberto tried to start the engine several more times, but it was clear that the fuel system was completely compromised. The Santa Maria was now a powerless vessel, drifting 60 miles from shore, with no means of propulsion. Roberto reached for his VHF radio to call for assistance. But when he keyed the microphone, he was met with static. The radio, which had worked perfectly that morning, was now receiving and transmitting nothing but white noise. Selena's radio, this is fishing vessel Santa Maria. With a mayday, Roberto called repeatedly, but there was no response. The radio was dead. Roberto spent the next 2 hours trying to repair both his engine and his radio, but neither problem was fixable with the equipment he carried on board. The engine failure was mechanical and would require machine shop repairs. The radio failure appeared to be electronic, possibly caused by a power surge or component failure. By 4:00 p.m., Roberto was facing a serious, but not yet desperate situation. He was stranded without power or communications, but he had emergency flares, adequate food and water, and reasonable hope that other fishing boats would pass through the area within a day or two. Somebody will see me, Roberto told himself with confidence that was partly real and partly forced. This is a popular fishing area. Another boat will come along. But as the afternoon progressed, Roberto began to notice changes in the weather that weren't in the forecast. The wind was picking up from the northwest, and dark clouds were building on the horizon. The gentle swells that had made for comfortable fishing were beginning to build into larger waves. Roberto checked his weather radio for updated forecasts, but the device was part of the same electronic system that had failed with his VHF radio. He was now not only without communications, but also without access to weather information. By 6:00 p.m., it was clear that a significant storm was approaching. The wind had increased to 25-30 knots, and waves were building to 8-10 feet. Roberto began preparing his boat for heavy weather, securing everything that could come loose, and checking his safety equipment. Just a squall, Roberto told himself as he watched the approaching storm clouds. It'll blow through in a few hours, then I can signal for help when it clears. But Roberto's optimism was based on the original weather forecast, which had predicted stable conditions. What was approaching was not a brief squall, but a major storm system that had developed rapidly and moved faster than meteorologists had predicted. By 8:00 p.m., the Santa Maria was being battered by 40-knot winds and 15-foot seas. Roberto was struggling to keep his boat headed into the waves to prevent it from being rolled by the massive swells. Without engine power, he could only deploy a sea anchor to help maintain his heading and hope that the storm would pass quickly. But the storm didn't pass quickly. It intensified through the night, with winds reaching 50-60 knots and waves building to 20 feet or more. The Santa Maria, designed for offshore fishing, but not for riding out major storms without power, was taking a brutal beating. At 3:30 a.m. on March 16, 11 hours after his engine failed, Roberto heard a sound that every sailor dreads: the sharp crack of structural failure. A large wave had broken over the boat's stern, and the impact had cracked the hull near the waterline. Water began pouring into the engine compartment, faster than Roberto could pump it out. He realized with growing horror that the Santa Maria was sinking, and there was nothing he could do to save her. Roberto had perhaps 15 minutes to gather emergency supplies and launch his life raft before his boat went down. 15 minutes to collect everything he would need to survive alone on the Pacific Ocean, with no idea when or if rescue would come. As he activated his life raft and began throwing emergency supplies into the rubber boat, Roberto made a conscious decision that would define everything that followed. "I'm going home," he said aloud, as if making a promise to the ocean itself. "I don't know how, and I don't know when, but I'm going home to my family." It was a declaration of intent that would sustain Roberto through the next 86 days of the most challenging survival ordeal imaginable. The life raft that would become Roberto's home for the next 3 months was a standard 6-person emergency raft designed to keep shipwreck survivors alive long enough for rescue to arrive. It measured 6 feet in diameter, had an inflatable floor and canopy, and contained basic survival supplies, intended to sustain 6 people for approximately 10 days. But Roberto was one person facing a survival scenario that could last much longer than 10 days, and he was in one of the most remote areas of the Pacific Ocean, where rescue ships rarely passed and search aircraft never flew. As the Santa Maria disappeared beneath the waves at 4:15 a.m. on March 16, Roberto found himself alone on the life raft in complete darkness, surrounded by 20-foot waves and howling wind. The storm that had sunk his boat was still raging, and the tiny raft was being thrown around like a cork in a washing machine. "Okay, Roberto," he said to himself, his voice barely audible over the wind. "You're alive. You have a raft. You have some supplies. Now you just need to stay alive until someone finds you." Roberto's first priority was taking inventory of his survival supplies. The life raft's emergency kit contained 12 cans of emergency drinking water 500 ml each, 24 emergency food rations high-calorie bars, a hand-operated desalinator for making fresh water from seawater, emergency flare 6 aerial, 4 handheld, a signal mirror, a fishing kit with hooks, line, and lures, a first aid kit, a solar still for collecting rainwater, emergency blankets, a manual air pump for maintaining raft pressure. It was a reasonable survival kit for a short-term emergency, but Roberto quickly realized that if rescue didn't come within 2 weeks, he would be facing starvation and dehydration in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. 2 weeks, Roberto calculated aloud. If I ration carefully, maybe 3 weeks. Someone will find me by then. But Roberto's optimism was based on assumptions that would prove to be dangerously wrong. He assumed that his disappearance would trigger a search and rescue operation. He assumed that other fishing boats would pass through the area and spot his raft. He assumed that 3 weeks would be more than enough time for rescue to arrive. What Roberto didn't know was that his failure to return to port would not be reported for several days, since he had told people he might extend his trip if fishing was good. He didn't know that the storm had pushed his raft far from normal shipping lanes into one of the most remote areas of the Pacific, and he didn't know that the ocean currents in this region would carry him even further from civilization over the coming weeks. The storm that had sunk the Santa Maria raged for another 18 hours, battering Roberto's raft with waves that sometimes reached 25 feet. The tiny rubber boat would climb up the face of each massive wave, pause for a terrifying moment at the crest, then slide down the backside into the trough, only to start the cycle again with the next wave. Roberto spent those 18 hours in a state of controlled terror, bailing water out of the raft, adjusting the sea anchor to keep the raft oriented properly, and fighting seasickness that made him vomit repeatedly. Despite his years of experience on the ocean, just hold on, Roberto told himself during the worst moments. Storms always end. This will end. When the storm finally passed on the evening of March 16, Roberto found himself in a surreal new world. The ocean was calm again, painted in sunset colors that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. But in every direction, as far as he could see, there was nothing but water. For the first time since his ordeal began, Roberto fully comprehended his situation. He was alone on a tiny raft in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, with no way to signal for help, except for a few emergency flares that he needed to save for when rescue aircraft or ships were actually visible. "Okay," Roberto said aloud, needing to hear a human voice, even if it was his own. "Day 1. Someone will come looking for me. I just need to stay alive until they get here." Roberto established a survival routine that would become crucial to his psychological and physical survival. Each morning, he would inventory his supplies, check the condition of his raft, and scan the horizon for any signs of ships or aircraft. Each evening, he would write in a small notebook he had grabbed from his boat, documenting his location as best he could estimate, his physical condition, and his thoughts. March 17, Day 2, Roberto wrote in his notebook. Calm seas, clear sky, no ships or planes visible. Feeling weak from seasickness, but drinking water and eating 1 ration bar per day. Someone will find me soon. The routine gave Roberto a sense of purpose and control in a situation where he had very little of either. But as days turned into weeks, that routine would be tested by physical deterioration, psychological stress, and the growing realization that rescue might not come as quickly as he had hoped. Roberto's greatest challenge in those first days was not physical but psychological. The vastness of the ocean was psychologically overwhelming, in a way that no amount of previous sea experience had prepared him for. When you're on a boat, even a small boat, you have a sense of purpose and destination. On a life raft, you're just a speck floating on an infinite expanse of water, completely at the mercy of currents and weather. Don't think about how big the ocean is, Roberto coached himself. Think about staying alive today. Just today. Tomorrow will take care of itself. But as one day became 3, then 5, then a week, Roberto began to confront the possibility that his survival ordeal might last much longer than he had anticipated. On day 8, Roberto used one of his precious emergency flares when he spotted what appeared to be a ship on the horizon. He fired the aerial flare high into the clear afternoon sky, where it burst into bright red light that should have been visible for miles. Roberto watched the distant ship through the binoculars he had salvaged from the Santa Maria, waiting for any sign that his distress signal had been seen. For 20 minutes, he watched the ship maintain its course, without any indication that his flare had been noticed. "They didn't see me," Roberto said to himself, as the ship disappeared over the horizon. "I'm too small, too far away. They didn't see me." It was Roberto's first real encounter with the crushing realization that would define much of his ordeal. In the vastness of the Pacific Ocean, a life raft is virtually invisible unless rescuers know exactly where to look. But Roberto didn't give up. He couldn't give up. Giving up would mean death, and Roberto had made a promise to himself and to his family that he was going home. Next time, Roberto told himself, next time a ship comes by, I'll be ready. I'll make them see me. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into a month, Roberto would discover that holding on to hope when hope seems irrational requires a kind of mental strength that most people never have to develop. He was about to learn what it truly means to be alone. By day 15, Roberto Silva's survival had become primarily a psychological battle. His physical condition was declining. He had lost over 20 pounds and was showing signs of dehydration despite careful water rationing. But his mental state was the real determinant of whether he would live or die. The human mind is not designed to cope with the kind of isolation and hopelessness that Roberto was experiencing, floating alone on an endless ocean with no human contact and no concrete reason to believe that rescue would ever come. Push his consciousness to its breaking point. Roberto found himself talking aloud constantly, sometimes to himself, sometimes to imaginary companion, sometimes to his deceased father, who had also been a fisherman. "Papa, I need your help," Roberto would say, addressing the empty horizon. "You knew these waters better than anyone. Tell me which way to paddle. Tell me where the shipping lanes are." These conversations with hallucinated figures were not signs of mental breakdown, but rather adaptive mechanisms that helped Roberto maintain psychological stability. The human brain will create social connections even when none exist, because isolation is more psychologically damaging than imaginary companionship. Roberto's notebook entries from this period reveal the intensity of his psychological struggle. Day 16. No ships today. Starting to wonder if anyone is looking for me. Maybe they think I'm dead already. Saw dolphins this morning at least. I'm not completely alone. Trying to catch fish but no luck yet. Water is getting low. Day 18. Caught my first fish. Small tuna, maybe 2 pounds. Ate it raw. Tasted like the best meal I've ever had. Feeling stronger. Someone will find me. They have to. Day 22. 3 weeks. How is it possible that no one has found me in 3 weeks? The ocean can't be that big. There have to be ships somewhere. Maybe I'm in the wrong place. Maybe I should try to paddle somewhere else. But where? The question of whether to stay in one location or try to paddle toward potential rescue became an obsession for Roberto. Standard survival wisdom suggests staying in one place to make yourself easier to find, but Roberto had no way of knowing if anyone was even looking for him, much less where they might be searching. Roberto's life raft was equipped with 2 small paddles, and he experimented with paddling in different directions, hoping to reach shipping lanes or drift toward more populated areas. But paddling a life raft against ocean currents is nearly impossible, and Roberto's efforts mostly exhausted him without significantly changing his position. "I'm going in circles," Roberto wrote on day 25. "I paddle all day and end up in the same place. The current is stronger than I am. Maybe I'm supposed to drift. Maybe the current will carry me somewhere I can be found." Roberto's relationship with the ocean itself began to change during this period. Initially, he had viewed the sea as an adversary, the force that had sunk his boat and was keeping him from his family. But as weeks passed, Roberto began to see the ocean as a complex entity that could be hostile or helpful, depending on circumstances he couldn't control. "The ocean is not trying to kill me," Roberto wrote on day 28. "It's just being the ocean. Storms and calm, currents and tides, fish and sharks. I'm just a guest here. I need to learn the rules." This philosophical shift was crucial to Roberto's psychological survival. Instead of fighting against forces he couldn't control, he began trying to work with the ocean environment. He studied the behavior of birds and fish to predict weather changes. He learned to read the subtle signs that indicated the presence of marine life. He developed an almost mystical connection with the rhythms of sea and sky. But Roberto's most dangerous enemy during this period was not hunger, thirst, or exposure. It was despair. There were days when the psychological weight of his situation became almost unbearable, when the logical part of his mind calculated his odds of survival and concluded that continuing to fight was pointless. Day 31. 1 month. 1 whole month and no one has found me. Maybe no one is looking anymore. Maybe they gave up. Maybe I should give up too. It would be so much easier to just stop fighting. These moments of despair were the closest Roberto came to giving up entirely. The rational part of his mind could construct compelling arguments for why continued survival was impossible. His supplies were nearly gone. He was losing weight rapidly. He was thousands of miles from land, and no rescue operation could possibly cover the vast area where he might be located. But Roberto had made a promise to himself and to his family that he would survive, and that promise became stronger than rational calculation. No, Roberto wrote after a particularly dark entry. I don't care what the odds are. I don't care how impossible this seems. I told my wife I would come home, and I'm going to keep that promise, even if it kills me trying. Roberto's commitment to survival was tested most severely during his encounters with marine life. The Pacific Ocean around his raft was full of creatures that ranged from helpful to dangerous, and Roberto had to learn to navigate these encounters with minimal equipment and no backup if things went wrong. Dolphins were frequent visitors to Roberto's raft, and their presence became psychologically crucial to his survival. The intelligent marine mammals seemed curious about the lone human, and Roberto began to view them as companions and sources of hope. The dolphins came back today, Roberto wrote on day 35. Same group, I think. They swim around the raft and look at me like they're trying to figure out what I'm doing here. I talk to them, tell them about my family. They seem to listen. Maybe they'll lead a ship to me. But Roberto also encountered sharks, which represented a constant and very real threat to his survival. Tiger sharks and oceanic whitetips were common in these waters, and Roberto's raft occasionally attracted their attention. He learned to remain completely still when sharks were present, avoiding any movements that might trigger an attack. Day 38. Sharks today. 3 of them, big ones. They circled the raft for an hour. I didn't move, barely breathed. They finally lost interest and swam away. Reminded me that I'm not at the top of the food chain out here. Roberto's fishing efforts became more successful as he learned to adapt his techniques to life raft conditions, using hooks and line from the emergency kit, plus improvised lures made from pieces of his equipment. Roberto was able to catch small fish that supplemented his dwindling emergency ration. Caught 2 fish today, Roberto wrote on day 42, learning that early morning and late afternoon are best times. Fish seem attracted to the shadow of the raft. Eating them raw isn't so bad anymore. Protein is protein, but catching fish from a life raft presented its own dangers. Roberto had to be careful not to puncture the raft with fish hooks or fins. He had to avoid attracting sharks with fish blood, and he had to process and eat his catch quickly in the tropical heat to avoid food poisoning. As Roberto's survival ordeal extended into its 2nd month, he began to realize that his situation was far more serious than he had initially understood. This was not a short-term emergency that would be resolved by a passing ship or a search aircraft. This was a long-term survival challenge that would test every aspect of his physical and mental endurance. Day 45. 6 weeks. I think I understand now. This isn't going to be quick. No one is coming to rescue me because no one knows where I am. I'm going to have to save myself somehow. I'm going to have to survive until I can find my own way home. It was a realization that could have been devastating, but for Roberto, it was oddly liberating. Instead of waiting helplessly for rescue that might never come, he could focus on the things he could control, staying alive, staying healthy, and finding ways to improve his situation. Roberto was about to enter the most challenging phase of his ordeal, when survival would require not just endurance but innovation, adaptation, and a level of mental toughness that would push him to the very edges of human capability. Day 50 marked a turning point in Roberto's survival ordeal. He had been adrift for over 7 weeks, longer than anyone in his family would have expected him to survive, and he was beginning to understand that his situation required more than just rationing supplies and waiting for rescue. Roberto needed to transform from a victim of circumstances into an active survivor who could adapt to life on the ocean indefinitely. "I'm not waiting anymore," Roberto wrote in his notebook. "I'm going to treat this raft like my home, this ocean like my neighborhood. I'm going to learn to live here, not just survive here." Roberto began systematically improving his life raft setup, using materials salvaged from his boat and improvised tools to increase his comfort, safety, and self-sufficiency. His first project was creating a more effective water collection system. The emergency solar still provided with the raft was designed for short-term use and produced only small amounts of fresh water. Roberto modified it using plastic sheeting from his emergency supplies, creating a larger collection surface that could capture more rainwater and produce more distilled seawater. New water system working well. Roberto noted on day 53, collected almost a liter of rainwater yesterday. The improved solar still is producing about 200 ml of fresh water per day in sunny conditions. Still not enough for long-term survival, but better than before. Roberto's fishing operations also became more sophisticated as he learned to read the ocean environment. He discovered that certain weather conditions and times of day were more productive for fishing. He learned to identify the types of floating debris that attracted fish. Most importantly, he learned to recognize the signs that indicated the presence of larger schools of fish. Fish behavior is predictable if you pay attention, Roberto wrote on day 56. Birds diving means bait fish on the surface. Bait fish means bigger fish below. Current lines and temperature changes concentrate fish. I'm starting to think like a fish to catch fish. Roberto's most important innovation was developing a system for long-term food preservation. In the tropical heat of the Pacific, caught fish would spoil within hours unless properly processed. Roberto learned to cut fish into thin strips and dry them in the sun, creating a form of jerky that could be stored for several days. "Fish jerky is keeping me alive," Roberto observed on day 60. "Can catch fish when conditions are good, then eat preserved fish when fishing is poor. Learning to balance calories consumed with calories expended. It's like managing a business, except the business is staying alive." But Roberto's innovations went beyond just food and water. He also had to solve problems related to hygiene, medical care, equipment maintenance, and psychological well-being. Maintaining hygiene on a life raft presents unique challenges. Roberto had to balance the need to stay clean with the need to conserve fresh water. He developed a system using seawater for basic washing, followed by freshwater rinses when his water supplies allowed. "Staying clean is staying healthy," Roberto wrote on day 63. Infection, rashes, and sores can become serious problems when you can't get medical care. Prevention is the only cure out here. Roberto also had to become his own doctor, treating minor injuries and illnesses with the limited supplies in his first aid kit. He developed infections from fish hooks, suffered from saltwater boils, and experienced digestive problems from his limited diet. Each medical issue required improvised solutions and careful monitoring. "Cut my hand on a fish hook today," Roberto noted on day 65. Cleaned it with fresh water, applied antibiotic ointment, covered with waterproof bandage. Can't let any injury become infected. No doctors out here except me. Equipment maintenance became a constant concern as Roberto's survival gear began to show wear from extended use in the harsh marine environment. The life raft itself required daily inspection and occasional repairs. The fishing equipment needed constant maintenance. The water collection systems required regular cleaning and adjustment. Everything breaks down out here, Roberto observed on day 68. Salt water corrodes metal, sun degrades plastic, constant movement wears out moving parts. I have to be mechanic, engineer, and inventor all at once. But perhaps Roberto's most crucial innovation was developing psychological coping mechanisms for the extreme isolation and uncertainty of his situation. He created daily routines that gave structure to his time. He set goals and challenges that gave purpose to his activities. He maintained detailed records that gave meaning to his experiences. Day 70, 10 weeks, Roberto wrote. I never thought I would survive this long, but here I am, starting to realize that I might be out here for months, not weeks. That changes everything. I need to think long-term now. Roberto began planning for seasonal changes in weather and ocean conditions. He researched from memory the migration patterns of fish and birds in this area of the Pacific. He calculated how much food and water he would need to survive until the next rainy season, when he could replenish his water supplies. Rainy season should start in about 6 weeks, Roberto calculated on day 72. Need to prepare containers to collect as much water as possible. Also need to stock up on dried fish before the weather makes fishing more difficult. Roberto's relationship with the ocean continued to evolve during this period. He began to see patterns in the currents, weather, and marine life that were invisible during his first weeks of survival. He developed an almost supernatural ability to predict weather changes based on subtle signs in the water and sky. The ocean is talking to me, Roberto wrote on day 75. Color changes in the water tell me about currents. Clouds on the horizon tell me about weather. Bird behavior tells me about fish. I'm learning the language. But Roberto's most important realization during this period was that survival was not just about staying alive. Until rescue arrived, it was about adapting to a new way of life that might continue indefinitely. I don't know if anyone is looking for me anymore, Roberto wrote on day 78. I don't know if I'll ever be rescued, but I know I can survive out here if I keep learning, keep adapting, keep fighting. This ocean is vast, but it's not empty. There's life everywhere. I just need to learn how to be part of it. Roberto had transformed from a shipwreck victim into something else entirely. A man who had learned to live on the ocean, who had adapted to one of the most hostile environments on Earth, who had found ways to thrive where most people would have died. But Roberto's greatest test was yet to come. As his survival ordeal entered its third month, he would face challenges that would push his innovation, his adaptations, and his will to survive to their absolute limits. Day 80. Roberto Silva had been alone on the Pacific Ocean for nearly 3 months, longer than any documented survival at sea in recent history. His body had adapted to his harsh environment in ways that seemed almost superhuman. He had learned to function. Day 80. Roberto Silva had been alone on the Pacific Ocean for nearly 3 months, longer than any documented survival at sea in recent history. His body had adapted to his harsh environment in ways that seemed almost superhuman. He had learned to function on minimal food and water, to sleep while constantly alert for danger, and to maintain hope in circumstances that would have broken most people weeks earlier. But adaptation has its limits, and Roberto was approaching his. The psychological toll of extreme isolation was becoming impossible to ignore. Roberto found himself having elaborate conversations with people who weren't there, seeing ships on the horizon that vanished when he looked directly at them, and experiencing periods of confusion where he couldn't remember what day it was or how long he had been at sea. Day 80. I think Roberto wrote in his notebook, his handwriting noticeably less steady than in earlier entries. Or maybe 81. Hard to keep track. Saw Maria today. She was sitting on the edge of the raft, telling me to come home for dinner. Then she was gone. I know she wasn't really there, but it felt so real. Maria was Roberto's wife, and hallucinations of her had become increasingly frequent and vivid. Sometimes she would appear to offer comfort and encouragement. Other times she would plead with Roberto to stop fighting and come home. These visions were both psychologically comforting and deeply disturbing because Roberto understood that they indicated his mind was beginning to break down under the stress of prolonged isolation. Roberto's physical condition was also deteriorating despite his successful adaptations. He had lost over 40 pounds and was showing signs of chronic malnutrition. His skin was covered with salt sores and sun damage. His hair had become thin and brittle. Most concerning, he was experiencing periods of weakness and confusion that suggested his body's systems were beginning to fail. Can barely write today, Roberto noted on day 82. Hands shaking, vision blurry. Caught a fish but could barely pull it into the raft. Need to eat more, but fish have been scarce for a week. Starting to understand why people don't survive this long at sea. Roberto was entering what survival experts call the breaking point, the phase of extreme survival, where the human body and mind begin to shut down despite the person's will to continue fighting. It's the point where holding on becomes not just difficult but seemingly impossible. The ocean seemed to sense Roberto's vulnerability. For 5 consecutive days, he was unable to catch any fish, despite his improved techniques and equipment. His water supplies dropped to critical levels when his solar still malfunctioned due to salt buildup. Most dangerously, Roberto began experiencing episodes where he would lose consciousness for periods ranging from minutes to hours. Day 85. Woke up on the floor of the raft. Don't remember falling asleep. Sun is in different position. Lost several hours. This is bad. If I can't stay conscious, I can't survive. Roberto realized that he was facing a medical emergency that could kill him, even if rescue arrived immediately. His body was consuming its own muscle and organ tissue to maintain basic functions. His blood chemistry was probably severely imbalanced from months of inadequate nutrition. His immune system was compromised, making him vulnerable to infections that would normally be minor. But Roberto had come too far to give up now. He had survived 85 days through determination, innovation, and sheer force of will. He had proven that the human spirit could endure things that medical science said were impossible. I've made it this far, Roberto wrote, with tremendous effort on day 86. 86 days. If I can make it one more day, I can make it forever. Just one more day. Roberto didn't know it, but he wouldn't need forever. His ordeal was about to end in the most unexpected way possible. Day 86 began like every other day for the past 3 months. Roberto performed his morning routine, checking the raft for damage, scanning the horizon for ships, taking inventory of his meager supplies. But his movements were slower than usual, his observations less sharp. He was operating on the edge of physical and mental collapse. 86 days, Roberto whispered to himself, his voice hoarse from dehydration. 86 days and still alive, still fighting. Roberto's water situation had become critical. His solar still had produced only a few drops the previous day, and his stored water was down to less than a cup. In the tropical heat of the Pacific, a person could survive perhaps 3 days without water under the best conditions. Roberto was not in the best conditions. Need rain, Roberto said aloud, studying the cloudless sky. Need fish. Need miracle. Roberto had used those exact words, need miracle, dozens of times over the past 3 months. It had become a mantra, a prayer, a statement of defiance against impossible odds. But on day 86, for the first time since his ordeal began, Roberto's prayer was about to be answered. At 10:30 a.m., while Roberto was dozing in the shade of his makeshift canopy, he was awakened by a sound he hadn't heard in 3 months, the distant rumble of a ship's engine. Roberto's eyes snapped open, and he immediately grabbed his binoculars to scan the horizon. At first, he saw nothing. The sound seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere, possibly another auditory hallucination, brought on by dehydration and exhaustion. But then he saw it, a small dark shape on the horizon, perhaps 5 miles away. A ship, heading roughly in his direction. Roberto's heart began pounding with a mixture of excitement and terror. He had fantasized about this moment for months, but now that it was happening, he was paralyzed by the fear that the ship would pass without seeing him. "This is it," Roberto said aloud, forcing himself to move despite his weakness. "This is my chance. Don't mess this up." Roberto's hands shook as he reached for his emergency flares. He had started his ordeal with 10 flares, 6 aerial flares, and 4 handheld signal flares. Over the past 3 months, he had used 7 of them to signal ships and aircraft that either hadn't seen him or had been too far away to respond. He had 3 flares left, 3 chances to signal for rescue from a ship that might or might not see him. Roberto forced himself to wait, watching the ship through his binoculars and calculating its course. The vessel appeared to be a medium-sized cargo ship, possibly heading toward the Panama Canal. Its course would bring it within perhaps 2 miles of Roberto's position, close enough for his flares to be visible, but only if the crew was actually looking in his direction. "Wait," Roberto coached himself, his hands trembling with adrenaline and weakness. "Wait until they're closer. Make it count." Roberto spent 20 agonizing minutes watching the ship approach, calculating the optimal moment to fire his flare. Too early, and the flare might not be visible. Too late, and the ship might pass beyond effective signaling range. At 11:15 a.m., when the ship was approximately 2 miles away, Roberto fired his first aerial flare. The flare shot into the clear morning sky, reaching an altitude of several hundred feet, before bursting into bright red light that was visible for miles in every direction. Roberto watched through his binoculars, desperately looking for any sign that someone on the ship had seen his signal. For 5 minutes, the ship maintained its course, without any change in direction or speed. Roberto began to feel the familiar crushing disappointment that had followed his previous failed rescue attempts. "They didn't see it," Roberto said, tears of frustration streaming down his face. How could they not see it? But Roberto still had 2 flares left, and the ship was still within range. He waited another 5 minutes, then fired his second flare. This time, Roberto thought he detected a slight change in the ship's course. It was subtle, possibly just wishful thinking, but the vessel seemed to be turning slightly in his direction. "Come on," Roberto pleaded, watching the ship through his binoculars. "Please see me. Please don't leave me here." Roberto fired his third and final flare, putting everything he had into the signal. The bright red light burst overhead just as the morning sun created optimal visibility conditions. And this time, there was no doubt. The ship was turning toward him. Roberto could see crew members moving on the ship's deck, pointing in his direction. He could see the vessel's course change dramatically as it headed directly toward his position. After 86 days of fighting for survival alone on the Pacific Ocean, Roberto Silva was about to be rescued. "They see me," Roberto shouted, his voice breaking with emotion. "They see me. I'm going home." Roberto used his signal mirror to flash sunlight toward the approaching ship, providing a continuous signal to help guide them to his exact position. He waved his arms frantically. Despite his weakness, he shouted greetings in Spanish and English, though the ship was still too far away for voices to carry. As the cargo ship drew closer, Roberto could read its name painted on the hull, Pacific Star, registered in Panama. The crew was lowering a small boat to make the actual rescue. since the large cargo ship couldn't safely approach Roberto's tiny life raft. At 12:30 p.m. on March 11, 2020, exactly 86 days after the Santa Maria had sunk, Roberto Silva was pulled aboard the Pacific Star's rescue boat by 3 crew members who couldn't believe what they were seeing. "How long have you been out there?" asked Captain Miguel Santos in Spanish, wrapping Roberto in blankets and offering him fresh water. 86 days, Roberto replied, his voice weak but clear. "I've been out here for 86 days. The rescue crew exchanged glances of amazement. They had participated in numerous maritime rescues during their careers, but they had never encountered anyone who had survived alone at sea for nearly 3 months. 86 days, Captain Santos repeated, shaking his head in disbelief. "That's impossible. No one survives that long on a life raft." "I did," Roberto said simply. "I promised my family I would come home." The rescue boat that carried Roberto to safety was a simple workboat designed for routine operations around the cargo ship. But to Roberto, it felt like the most luxurious vessel he had ever been aboard. The solid deck beneath his feet, the fresh water they gave him to drink, the presence of other human beings, it was overwhelming after 86 days of complete isolation. Easy, said Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the ship's medical officer, as Roberto tried to drink too much water too quickly. "Small sips. Your body needs to readjust gradually." Roberto's physical condition shocked the rescue crew. He had lost nearly 50 pounds. His skin was severely damaged by sun and salt exposure, and he was showing signs of advanced malnutrition and dehydration. But what amazed them most was his mental clarity and emotional stability. Most people who survive even a week at sea are completely traumatized, Dr. Rodriguez observed as she examined Roberto. "But you seem remarkably coherent and calm." "I had a lot of time to think," Roberto replied with a weak smile. 3 months of thinking. I worked through most of my fear and panic weeks ago." The Pacific Star's crew had been alerted to Roberto's presence by their lookout, who had spotted the flare and immediately notified the bridge. Captain Santos had ordered an immediate course change to investigate, even though deviating from their schedule would cost the shipping company time and money. "We see a lot of debris in these waters," Captain Santos explained to Roberto as they headed toward the cargo ship. "But when we saw that flare, and then saw a person on a raft, we couldn't believe it. We thought it might be a training exercise or a movie being filmed." Roberto's life raft was brought aboard the Pacific Star as evidence of his extraordinary survival ordeal. The crew examined the improvised modifications Roberto had made, the enhanced water collection system, the fishing equipment, the food preservation setup, with professional admiration. "You turned that emergency raft into a survival homestead," observed Chief Engineer Carlos Mendez. "The modifications you made are brilliant. You basically redesigned the entire system for long-term survival." But the crew's admiration was mixed with concern about Roberto's physical condition. Dr. Rodriguez's medical examination revealed the full extent of the damage that 86 days at sea had inflicted on his body. Severe dehydration, malnutrition, multiple vitamin deficiencies, extensive sun damage, several untreated infections, and probable muscle wasting, Dr. Rodriguez cataloged. "You need immediate medical care, but you're stable. The question is how you survived this long in this condition." Roberto's answer was simple. "I refused to give up. The Pacific Star was 3 days away from its next port of call in Panama, where Roberto could receive proper medical care. During those 3 days, Roberto began the process of readjusting to human society. After 3 months of complete isolation, the crew treated Roberto like a celebrity, gathering around him during meal times to hear stories of his survival. Roberto found their attention both gratifying and overwhelming after so long alone. The hardest part wasn't the hunger or thirst. Roberto told the assembled crew during dinner on his first night aboard. The hardest part was the loneliness. I started talking to dolphins, having conversations with people who weren't there. The human mind isn't designed for that level of isolation. Roberto's notebook, which had documented every day of his ordeal, became a source of fascination for the crew. His daily entries provided a real-time account of extreme survival that read like an adventure novel. Day 23. Caught 3 fish today. Learning to read the water. Dolphins came by again. I think they are looking out for me. Day 45. 6 weeks. Can't believe I've been out here this long. Starting to think differently about time, about what's important. The ocean is teaching me things I never knew I needed to learn. Day 67. Storm yesterday. Raft held together, but barely. Realized that I'm not just surviving anymore, I'm living. This is my life now, and I'm going to make the best of it. Captain Santos was particularly interested in Roberto's navigation notes and weather observations. You documented everything with incredible detail, he observed. Your notes about currents and weather patterns are as accurate as our professional instruments. When your life depends on understanding your environment, you learn to pay attention, Roberto replied. The crew was also amazed by Roberto's physical adaptation to life at sea. His hands had developed thick calluses from constant rope work and fish handling. His eyes had adapted to scanning vast distances for signs of rescue or danger. His body had learned to function on minimal food and water in ways that seemed to defy medical science. You've basically evolved into a different kind of human doctor, Rodriguez observed. Your body learned to survive in conditions that would kill most people. But perhaps most remarkably, Roberto showed no signs of the psychological trauma that typically affects long-term survival situations. He was not depressed, anxious, or exhibiting symptoms of post-traumatic stress. Instead, he seemed almost euphoric about his rescue and eager to return to normal life. I never gave up hope, Roberto explained when asked about his mental state. Even on the worst days, even when I thought I might die, I never stopped believing that I would somehow make it home. That belief kept me sane. As the Pacific Star approached Panama, Roberto began to think about reuniting with his family. He had been missing for nearly 3 months, and he knew that his wife and children had probably given up hope of ever seeing him alive. What will you tell them about what happened out there? Captain Santos asked. Roberto thought for a moment before answering. I'll tell them that I learned what it really means to hold on. Not just to life, but to hope, to purpose, to the belief that every day is worth fighting for. The Pacific Star docked in Panama City on March 14, 2020, exactly 89 days after Roberto had set out for what was supposed to be a 3-day fishing trip. The media was waiting at the dock, having been alerted to Roberto's remarkable survival story by the ship's radio communications. But Roberto's first concern was not the reporters or the medical personnel waiting to examine him. His first concern was contacting his family to let them know he was alive. The phone call that Roberto Silva made from the Port Authority office in Panama City was perhaps the most emotional conversation of his life. For 89 days, his wife Maria had lived with the terrible uncertainty of not knowing whether her husband was alive or dead. The Ecuadorian Coast Guard had searched for Roberto for 2 weeks after his disappearance, before declaring him lost at sea. Maria had grieved, had begun the process of rebuilding her life as a widow, and had tried to help their 2 children ages 8 and 12 cope with the loss of their father. The call from Panama was like receiving news that someone had returned from the dead. "Maria, it's me," Roberto said when she answered the phone, his voice shaking with emotion. Roberto Maria's voice was barely a whisper. "Roberto, is that really you?" "It's me, my love. I'm alive. I'm coming home." The conversation that followed was a mixture of tears, laughter, disbelief, and overwhelming joy. Maria had given up hope weeks earlier, when the official search was called off. She had been planning Roberto's memorial service, trying to figure out how to support their family alone, and struggling to accept that the love of her life was gone forever. "How?" Maria asked through her tears. "How are you alive?" "They said no one could survive that long at sea. I promised you I would come home," Roberto replied. "I couldn't break that promise." Roberto's children, Sofia and Miguel, were at school when the call came. Maria immediately drove to their school to bring them home and share the impossible news that their father was alive. "Papa's alive?" 8-year-old Sofia asked, unable to process what her mother was telling her. "He's alive, and he's coming home," Maria confirmed, holding both children as they cried together. Meanwhile, in Panama, Roberto was dealing with a whirlwind of medical examinations, interviews, and administrative procedures required for someone who had been officially declared dead and was now very much alive. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, the emergency physician who examined Roberto at Panama City General Hospital, was amazed by his condition. "Given what you've been through, you're in remarkably good health," she told Roberto. "You're severely malnourished and dehydrated. You have multiple infections, and you've lost a dangerous amount of weight. But you're alive, you're coherent, and with proper treatment, you should make a full recovery." Roberto's story quickly attracted international media attention. Survival experts were fascinated by his innovations and adaptation. Maritime safety organizations wanted to study his techniques for potential inclusion in survival training programs. Psychologists were interested in how he had maintained mental stability during such extreme isolation. "What Mr. Silva accomplished is unprecedented in maritime survival history," said Dr. James Mitchell, a survival expert from the U.S. Navy's Survival Training Program. 86 days alone at sea is beyond what we thought was humanly possible. His story will change how we think about human survival capabilities. But Roberto was less interested in scientific analysis than in getting home to his family. After 3 days of medical treatment and interviews in Panama, he was finally cleared to travel back to Ecuador. The reunion at Guayaquil Airport was covered by news crews from across Latin America. Roberto's extended family, friends from the fishing community, and hundreds of supporters gathered to welcome home the man who had achieved the impossible. When Roberto emerged from the aircraft, the first person he saw was Maria, standing at the gate with tears streaming down her face. Their embrace lasted several minutes, both of them crying too hard to speak. "I kept my promise," Roberto whispered in Maria's ear. "I came home." Roberto's children were initially shy around their father, who looked dramatically different after his ordeal. He was much thinner, his skin was weathered and scarred, and his hair had turned partially gray from the stress and malnutrition. But when he knelt down and opened his arms, Sofia and Miguel ran to him without hesitation. "Papa, we thought you were gone forever," Miguel said, holding onto his father. "I was never gone," Roberto replied. "I was always coming back to you." Roberto's return to normal life was not without challenges. After 3 months of complete isolation, he found the noise and activity of everyday life overwhelming. He had trouble sleeping in a bed after months of sleeping on the hard floor of a life raft. He experienced anxiety in crowded places and had difficulty readjusting to social interaction. "For months, I didn't hear any sound except wind and waves," Roberto explained to a therapist who was helping him with the transition. "Suddenly being around cars, televisions, conversations, it's like sensory overload." Roberto also struggled with survivor's guilt and the knowledge that his survival had been largely due to luck, that the Pacific Star had passed through his area, luck that his flares had been seen, luck that his improvised survival systems had worked long enough to keep him alive. "Why did I survive when so many other people who go missing at sea don't?" Roberto asked during one of his therapy sessions. "What made me special?" Maybe it wasn't luck, his therapist suggested. Maybe it was your refusal to give up, your innovations, your mental strength. Maybe you survived because you never stopped fighting. Roberto gradually began to see his survival not as a random stroke of luck, but as the result of choices. He had made the choice to prepare carefully for his fishing trips, the choice to fight for survival when it would have been easier to give up, the choice to innovate and adapt when his initial supplies ran out, and most importantly, the choice to hold on to hope when hope seemed irrational. 6 months after his rescue, Roberto returned to fishing. Though he made significant changes to his safety procedure, he invested in better emergency equipment, including a satellite communication device that would allow him to call for help from anywhere on the ocean. He limited his solo trips to shorter distances and duration, and he always carried enough supplies for extended survival, just in case. "The ocean is still my livelihood," Roberto explained to reporters who questioned his decision to return to the sea. "I'm not going to let fear keep me from doing what I love, but I'm going to be smarter about it." Roberto also began speaking at maritime safety conferences and survival training programs, sharing his story and the techniques he had developed during his 86 days at sea. His survival manual, based on his notebook entries and innovations, became required reading for commercial fishermen and recreational sailors throughout Latin America. Roberto Silva redefined what we thought was possible in terms of ocean survival, said Captain Lisa Martinez of the International Maritime Safety Organization. His story has saved lives by teaching people that survival is possible, even in the most desperate circumstances. But perhaps Roberto's most important contribution was the example he set for never giving up, even when giving up seems like the only rational choice. 1 year after his rescue, Roberto Silva had become an internationally recognized expert on ocean survival. But more importantly, he had become a symbol of the human capacity to endure the impossible through sheer determination and refusal to surrender. Roberto's story had been featured in documentaries, survival manuals, and psychology textbooks as an example of extreme resilience. But for Roberto himself, the most meaningful aspect of his experience was not the fame or recognition. It was the profound changes in how he viewed life, relationships, and what truly matters. Before I spent 86 days alone on the ocean, I thought I knew what was important. Roberto reflected during a speaking engagement at a maritime safety conference. I thought success meant catching more fish, making more money, working longer hours. The ocean taught me that none of that matters if you don't have people to come home to. Roberto's relationship with his family had deepened in ways that seemed almost magical to those who knew them. The experience of nearly losing each other forever had eliminated the small annoyances and daily conflicts that plague most relationships. Roberto, Maria, and their children treasured every moment together with an intensity that was both beautiful and profound. We don't argue about trivial things anymore, Maria explained to a journalist writing about Roberto's story. When you face the possibility of never seeing each other again, you realize how precious every conversation is, even the difficult ones. Roberto's children had also been profoundly affected by their father's survival story. They had learned that their father was capable of extraordinary things, and that lesson had changed their own approach to challenges and setbacks. My papa never gave up even when he was alone on the ocean for 3 months. 13-year-old Miguel told his classmates during a school presentation about heroes. If he can do that, I can handle anything life gives me. 8-year-old Sophia had become fascinated with ocean life and marine biology as a result of her father's stories about dolphins, fish, and the sea environment that had become his temporary home. The ocean took care of Papa, she would tell people. The fish fed him, the dolphins kept him company, and the rain gave him water to drink. Roberto's survival techniques had been studied and incorporated into official maritime safety protocols by organizations around the world. His innovations in water collection, food preservation, and psychological coping mechanisms were now taught in survival courses from the U.S. Navy to the Japanese Coast Guard. Roberto Silva's survival methods represent a quantum leap in our understanding of what's possible in extreme maritime situations, explained Dr. Sarah Chen, director of the International Maritime Survival Institute. His techniques have already saved lives and will continue to save lives for decades to come. But Roberto was careful to emphasize that his survival had not been solely due to technical innovations or physical endurance. The psychological component, the mental decision to never give up, had been equally important. I could have had all the best equipment in the world, but if I had given up hope, I would have died, Roberto told audiences at his speaking engagements. The most important survival tool is not a piece of equipment. It's the decision to keep fighting even when fighting seems pointless. Roberto's story had particular resonance for people facing their own, seemingly impossible challenges. Cancer patients, people dealing with financial crises, individuals struggling with addiction, and others facing desperate circumstances found inspiration in Roberto's refusal to accept defeat. If Roberto could survive 86 days alone on the ocean, I can survive chemotherapy, wrote one cancer patient who had heard Roberto's story. His example reminds me that holding on is always possible, even when everything seems hopeless. Roberto received hundreds of letters from people who credited his story with helping them through their own difficult times. These letters, more than any scientific recognition or media attention, convinced Roberto that his ordeal had served a larger purpose. Maybe I was supposed to go through that experience, Roberto reflected. Maybe my survival story can help other people understand that they are stronger than they think they are. Roberto also became an advocate for maritime safety improvements, working with government agencies and international organizations to develop better emergency equipment and rescue procedures for commercial fishermen and recreational sailors. Too many people die at sea because they don't have adequate safety equipment, or because rescue operations can't find them in time, Roberto argued in testimony before maritime safety committees. My survival was partly due to luck, but it shouldn't require luck to survive a maritime emergency. Roberto's advocacy led to improvements in emergency beacon technology, better life raft designs, and enhanced search and rescue coordination for remote ocean areas. His survival story provided the compelling human element that motivated bureaucrats and politicians to approve funding for these life-saving improvements. Roberto Silva's experience demonstrated the gaps in our maritime safety systems, said Admiral Patricia Rodriguez, director of the Inter-American Coast Guard Association. His survival and his advocacy have made the ocean safer for everyone. 5 years after his rescue, Roberto had written a book about his experience titled 86 Days, Lessons from the Ocean. The book became an international bestseller, not just among sailors and survival enthusiasts, but among general readers who were inspired by Roberto's story of determination and hope. This is not just a survival story, wrote one reviewer. This is a story about the power of the human spirit to overcome any obstacle through faith, innovation, and absolute refusal to surrender. Roberto donated a significant portion of his book profits to maritime safety organizations and search and rescue operations, ensuring that his experience would continue to help save lives long after his own story faded from headlines. But perhaps Roberto's most important legacy was not his technical innovations or safety advocacy. It was the example he set for how to face impossible situations with courage, creativity, and unwavering determination. People ask me what I learned during those 86 days alone on the ocean, Roberto said during a television interview. On the 5th anniversary of his rescue, I learned that the human spirit is capable of things that seem impossible. I learned that giving up is always an option, but it's never the only option. And I learned that sometimes, when everything seems lost, the only thing you can do is hold on to hope, hold on to life, and hold on to the people you love. Roberto's story had become more than just an amazing tale of survival. It had become a testament to the power of holding on when letting go seems like the only logical choice. Roberto Silva's story didn't end with his rescue, or even with his successful readjustment to life on land. His 86-day survival ordeal created ripple effects that continued to spread outward, touching lives and changing perspectives around the world in ways that Roberto could never have anticipated. Dr. Michael Thompson, a psychiatrist who specialized in trauma and resilience, had been studying Roberto's case for several years when he made a remarkable discovery. Roberto's psychological profile showed not just an absence of post-traumatic stress disorder, but actually demonstrated what psychologists call post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon where people emerge from extreme adversity psychologically stronger than they were before. Roberto Silva represents a paradigm shift in how we understand human resilience. Dr. Thompson explained in a research paper that would influence trauma therapy approaches worldwide. His case demonstrates that under certain circumstances, extreme adversity can actually enhance psychological strength rather than damage it. The key factors in Roberto's psychological resilience, according to Dr. Thompson's analysis, were his sense of purpose, getting home to his family, his active problem-solving approach, constantly innovating and adapting, and his refusal to accept helplessness, even in the most desperate circumstances. Roberto never saw himself as a victim. Dr. Thompson observed, even when he was physically helpless, trapped on a life raft in the middle of the ocean, he maintained a sense of agency. He was always doing something, improving his equipment, solving problems, planning for the future. That sense of control, even in an uncontrollable situation, was crucial to his psychological survival. Roberto's approach to extreme survival began to influence therapeutic approaches for people dealing with various forms of trauma and adversity. Therapists started incorporating Roberto's principles into their treatment programs. Maintain a sense of purpose that extends beyond immediate survival. Focus on what you can control, not what you can't control. Break overwhelming problems into manageable daily tasks. Innovate and adapt continuously rather than accepting limitations. Never stop believing that survival is possible. These principles proved effective not just for trauma survivors, but for people facing a wide range of life challenges, from serious illness to financial crisis to relationship problems. Maria Elena Vasquez, a single mother who had lost her job and was facing eviction, credited Roberto's story with helping her through the darkest period of her life. When I heard about Roberto surviving 86 days alone on the ocean, I realized that I could survive being unemployed for a few months, she explained. His story taught me to focus on solving one problem at a time, instead of being overwhelmed by everything at once. Roberto's influence extended beyond individual stories of inspiration. His survival techniques were incorporated into official training programs for military personnel, emergency responders, and outdoor professionals around the world. The U.S. Navy's Sea Survival, Evasion, Resistance, Escape program added an entire module based on Roberto's innovations, particularly his psychological coping mechanisms for extreme isolation. Silva's mental survival techniques are as important as his physical innovations, explained Commander Sarah Martinez, director of the Navy's Survival Training Program. He proved that psychological preparation can be the difference between life and death in extreme circumstances. Roberto's water collection and food preservation methods were adopted by humanitarian organizations working in disaster zones and refugee camps. His techniques for maximizing resources and improvising equipment proved valuable in situations where people had to survive with minimal supplies for extended periods. Roberto Silva's innovations weren't just about surviving at sea, explained Dr. Jennifer Wong, who worked with Doctors Without Borders in developing emergency response protocols. His principles of resource maximization and continuous adaptation apply to any situation where people have to survive with limited resources. The fishing community in Ecuador had been particularly affected by Roberto's story. His survival had become a source of pride and inspiration for commercial fishermen who faced the ocean's dangers every day. Captain Manuel Rodriguez, president of the Ecuador Fishermen's Association, explained Roberto's impact on the industry. Before Roberto's story, when a fisherman was lost at sea, we would search for a few days and then give up. Now we search longer, and families hold on to hope longer, because Roberto proved that survival is possible, even when it seems impossible. Roberto's advocacy for improved maritime safety had led to significant policy changes. The International Maritime Organization had updated its safety requirements for commercial fishing vessels, mandating better emergency equipment and communication systems, partly in response to Roberto's survival story and recommendations. Roberto Silva's experience highlighted critical gaps in maritime safety protocols, explained Admiral Lisa Chen, chair of the IMO's Safety Committee. His survival and subsequent advocacy have made the ocean safer for millions of people who make their living from the sea. Roberto himself remained humble about his growing influence and the attention his story continued to receive. "I didn't survive to become famous," he would tell journalists. "I survived because I wanted to see my family again. If my story helps other people believe that they can overcome their own challenges, then maybe there was a reason I went through that experience." But Roberto's family understood better than anyone the broader significance of his survival story. Papa didn't just save himself, his daughter Sophia, now 13, explained to her classmates during a school presentation. He saved everyone who needed to know that giving up is never the only choice. Roberto's son Miguel, now 17, had been accepted to maritime engineering school, with plans to design better safety equipment for fishing vessels. "My father's story taught me that one person's experience can change the world," Miguel explained. "I want to use what happened to him to help make sure other families don't have to go through what we went through." Maria Silva had become an advocate for fishing families, working with organizations that provided support for the wives and children of fishermen lost at sea. "I know what it's like to believe your husband is never coming home," Maria explained. Roberto's story gives hope to families who are waiting for their own miracles. 10 years after his rescue, Roberto was invited to speak at the United Nations World Maritime Day ceremony, where he was recognized not just as a survival expert, but as a symbol of human resilience and the power of hope in the face of impossible circumstances. Roberto Silva's story reminds us that the human spirit is capable of extraordinary things, said UN Secretary General Maria Santos in her introduction. His 86 days alone at sea proved that with determination, innovation, and refusal to surrender. People can overcome challenges that seem insurmountable. Roberto's speech at the UN ceremony focused not on his own survival, but on the lessons his experience offered for humanity's approach to seemingly impossible challenges. Climate change, poverty, disease, conflict. These problems can seem as vast and overwhelming as the Pacific Ocean seemed to me. When I was floating alone on my life raft, Roberto told the assembly. But just like I learned to survive by focusing on what I could control, collecting water, catching fish, maintaining hope, humanity can address these challenges by focusing on what we can control, one day at a time, one innovation at a time, one act of determination at a time. Roberto's UN speech was broadcast worldwide and became one of the most watched addresses in the organization's recent history. His message that impossible challenges become manageable when broken down into daily acts of determination and innovation resonated with audiences facing everything from personal struggles to global crises. 15 years after his rescue, Roberto Silva stood on the deck of a new fishing vessel, the Segunda Oportunidad, Second Chance, watching his son Miguel prepare for his first solo fishing trip as a licensed captain. The circle of life on the ocean was continuing, but with profound differences, informed by Roberto's survival experience. Miguel's boat was equipped with the most advanced safety equipment available: satellite communication system, GPS emergency beacons, life rafts with enhanced survival supplies, and water makers that could produce fresh water indefinitely. But more importantly, Miguel had been trained from childhood in the psychological skills that had kept his father alive during his 86-day ordeal. Remember, Miguel, Roberto told his son as they reviewed the safety protocols one final time. Equipment can fail, weather can change, and unexpected things can happen. But your mind is your most important survival tool. Never give up, never stop innovating, and never stop believing that you can find a way home. Miguel nodded, understanding the weight of his father's words. He had grown up hearing the stories of those 86 days, and they had shaped his approach to life in ways that extended far beyond fishing and ocean safety. "I'm not afraid," Papa Miguel said. "Your story taught me that fear is just another problem to solve." Roberto smiled, recognizing his own words reflected back at him. The lessons of his survival had become family philosophy, passed down to the next generation, not as trauma but as wisdom. The fishing community had also evolved in the years since Roberto's rescue. His survival story had inspired a culture of enhanced safety awareness and mutual support among fishermen. A new protocol called Roberto's Rule required all fishing vessels to check in with each other daily, creating a network of support that made it much less likely for someone to disappear without anyone knowing. Roberto Silva changed how we think about safety on the ocean, explained Captain Maria Santos, now director of the Ecuador Maritime Safety Institute. His story taught us that survival is possible, even in the most desperate circumstances, but it also taught us that prevention is better than having to test those survival skills. Roberto's influence had also spread into unexpected areas. His techniques for psychological survival under extreme stress had been adapted for use in military training, space exploration preparation, and even corporate leadership development programs. NASA had consulted with Roberto when developing psychological support protocols for long-duration space missions. The isolation and resource limitations that Roberto faced on his life raft are similar to what astronauts experience on extended missions, explained Dr. Patricia Chen, director of NASA Behavioral Health Program. His mental survival techniques provide valuable insights for helping people maintain psychological stability in extreme isolation. The Roberto Silva Foundation, established with proceeds from his book sales and speaking engagements, had funded maritime safety improvements in developing countries around the world. The foundation had provided advanced safety equipment to fishing fleets, funded search and rescue operations, and supported families of fishermen lost at sea. Roberto's survival story gave him a platform to help save other lives, explained Maria Silva, who served as director of the foundation. He always said that surviving those 86 days was just the beginning. The real purpose was using that experience to help other people. Roberto himself had continued fishing, though with modified practices that reflected the lessons of his survival experience. He limited his solo trips, maintained constant communication with shore, and carried enough emergency supplies to survive for months if necessary. But more importantly, he approached his work with a deep appreciation for each day on the ocean and each safe return to port. Every sunset I see from the deck of my boat is a gift, Roberto reflected during an interview on the 15th anniversary of his rescue. Every fish I catch, every safe trip home, every meal with my family, none of it is guaranteed. My 86 days alone taught me to treasure the ordinary moments that most people take for granted. Roberto's story had been told and retold in dozens of languages, adapted into documentaries, dramatized in films, and studied in academic courses around the world. But for Roberto, the most meaningful legacy was the individual lives that had been changed by his example of refusing to give up. He received letters regularly from people who credited his story with helping them through their own impossible circumstances. Cancer survivors who had refused to stop fighting, refugees who had endured years in camps without losing hope, entrepreneurs who had persevered through failure after failure, parents who had never stopped searching for missing children. Your story taught me that giving up is a choice, not a necessity, wrote one letter from a woman who had survived a devastating car accident and learned to walk again despite doctors' predictions that she would be paralyzed for life. When the physical therapy was so painful I wanted to quit. I thought about you on that life raft, innovating and adapting and never stopping. If you could do that for 86 days, I could do rehabilitation exercises for one more day. These letters filled several filing cabinets in Roberto's home office, and he read each one carefully. They reminded him that his survival had meaning beyond his own life, that his 86 days of suffering had been transformed into a source of hope for countless other people facing their own seemingly impossible challenges. As Roberto watched Miguel's boat disappear over the horizon on his first solo fishing trip, he felt a complex mixture of pride, concern, and confidence. His son was well-trained, well-equipped, and most importantly, well-prepared psychologically for whatever challenges the ocean might present. He'll be fine, Maria said, joining Roberto at the harbor's edge. You taught him well. The ocean taught me well, Roberto corrected gently. I just passed along the lessons. Roberto's phone buzzed with a text message from Miguel. 4 hours out, seas calm, fish finder showing good activity. Thanks for the lessons, Papa. See you tomorrow night. Roberto smiled and typed back. Remember, one day at a time, one problem at a time. Never give up. Love you, Mijo. As the sun set over the Pacific, painting the water in the same golden colors, Roberto had watched for 86 consecutive days from his life raft. He reflected on how much his perspective on life had changed since his survival ordeal. I used to think the ocean was trying to kill me, Roberto mused aloud. Now I understand that the ocean was teaching me how to live. Day 50 marked a turning point in Roberto's survival ordeal. He had been adrift for over 7 weeks, longer than anyone in his family would have expected him to survive, and he was beginning to understand that his situation required more than just rationing supplies and waiting for rescue. Roberto needed to transform from a victim of circumstances into an active survivor who could adapt to life on the ocean indefinitely. I'm not waiting anymore, Roberto wrote in his notebook. I'm going to treat this raft like my home, this ocean like my neighborhood. I'm going to learn to live here, not just survive here. Roberto began systematically improving his life raft setup, using materials salvaged from his boat and improvised tools to increase his comfort, safety, and self-sufficiency. His first project was creating a more effective water collection system. The emergency solar still provided with the raft was designed for short-term use and produced only small amounts of fresh water. Roberto modified it using plastic sheeting from his emergency supplies, creating a larger collection surface that could capture more rainwater and produce more distilled seawater. New water system working well, Roberto noted on day 53. Collected almost a liter of rainwater yesterday. The improved solar still is producing about 200 ml of fresh water per day in sunny conditions. Still not enough for long-term survival, but better than before. Roberto's fishing operations also became more sophisticated as he learned to read the ocean environment. He discovered that certain weather conditions and times of day were more productive for fishing. He learned to identify the types of floating debris that attracted fish. Most importantly, he learned to recognize the signs that indicated the presence of larger schools of fish. Fish behavior is predictable if you pay attention, Roberto wrote on day 56. Birds diving means baitfish on the surface. Baitfish means bigger fish below. Current lines and temperature changes concentrate fish. I'm starting to think like a fish to catch fish. Roberto's most important innovation was developing a system for long-term food preservation. In the tropical heat of the Pacific, caught fish would spoil within hours unless properly processed. Roberto learned to cut fish into thin strips and dry them in the sun, creating a form of jerky that could be stored for several days. Fish jerky is keeping me alive, Roberto observed on day 60. Can catch fish when conditions are good, then eat preserved fish when fishing is poor. Learning to balance calories consumed with calories expended. It's like managing a business, except the business is staying alive. But Roberto's innovations went beyond just food and water. He also had to solve problems related to hygiene, medical care, equipment maintenance, and psychological well-being. Maintaining hygiene on a life raft presents unique challenges. Roberto had to balance the need to stay clean with the need to conserve fresh water. He developed a system using seawater for basic washing, followed by freshwater rinses when his water supplies allowed. Staying clean is staying healthy, Roberto wrote on day 63. Infection, rashes, and sores can become serious problems when you can't get medical care. Prevention is the only cure out here. Roberto also had to become his own doctor, treating minor injuries and illnesses with the limited supplies in his first aid kit. He developed infections from fish hooks, suffered from saltwater boils, and experienced digestive problems from his limited diet. Each medical issue required improvised solutions and careful monitoring. Cut my hand on a fish hook today, Roberto noted on day 65. Cleaned it with fresh water, applied antibiotic ointment, covered with waterproof bandage. Can't let any injury become infected. No doctors out here except me. Equipment maintenance became a constant concern, as Roberto's survival gear began to show wear from extended use in the harsh marine environment. The life raft itself required daily inspection and occasional repairs. The fishing equipment needed constant maintenance. The water collection systems required regular cleaning and adjustment. Everything breaks down out here, Roberto observed on day 68. Salt water corrodes metal, sun degrades plastic, constant movement wears out moving parts. I have to be mechanic, engineer, and inventor all at once. But perhaps Roberto's most crucial innovation was developing psychological coping mechanisms for the extreme isolation and uncertainty of his situation. He created daily routines that gave structure to his time. He set goals and challenges that gave purpose to his activities. He maintained detailed records that gave meaning to his experiences. Day 70, 10 weeks, Roberto wrote. I never thought I would survive this long, but here I am, starting to realize that I might be out here for months, not weeks. That changes everything. I need to think long-term now. Roberto began planning for seasonal changes in weather and ocean conditions. He researched from memory the migration patterns of fish and birds in this area of the Pacific. He calculated how much food and water he would need to survive until the next rainy season, when he could replenish his water supplies. Rainy season should start in about 6 weeks, Roberto calculated on day 72. Need to prepare containers to collect as much water as possible. Also need to stock up on dried fish before the weather makes fishing more difficult. Roberto's relationship with the ocean continued to evolve during this period. He began to see patterns in the currents, weather, and marine life that were invisible during his first weeks of survival. He developed an almost supernatural ability to predict weather changes based on subtle signs in the water and sky. The ocean is talking to me, Roberto wrote on day 75. Color changes in the water tell me about currents. Clouds on the horizon tell me about weather. Bird behavior tells me about fish. I'm learning the language. But Roberto's most important realization during this period was that survival was not just about staying alive. Until rescue arrived, it was about adapting to a new way of life that might continue indefinitely. I don't know if anyone is looking for me anymore, Roberto wrote on day 78. I don't know if I'll ever be rescued, but I know I can survive out here if I keep learning, keep adapting, keep fighting. This ocean is vast, but it's not empty. There's life everywhere. I just need to learn how to be part of it. Roberto had transformed from a shipwreck victim into something else entirely. A man who had learned to live on the ocean, who had adapted to one of the most hostile environments on Earth, who had found ways to thrive where most people would have died. But Roberto's greatest test was yet to come. As his survival ordeal entered its third month, he would face challenges that would push his innovation, his adaptations, and his will to survive to their absolute limits.